Pakistan assembled a ceasefire overnight. Iran said it doesn't accept deadlines.
Over 20% of the world's oil flows through one narrow waterway, and right now, that lifeline is at risk of becoming a pressure point for global conflict. What if a peace deal designed to stop a war is actually pushing both sides closer to the edge? In just 24 hours, the United States issued a deadline to Iran, but Tehran didn't just reject it, they challenged the entire approach to diplomacy. Meanwhile, a key U.S. ally in the Gulf is stepping back, and tensions around the Strait of Hormuz are quietly rising. So what's really happening behind the scenes? And more importantly, are we watching the collapse of peace or the beginning of something far bigger? At the center of this unfolding situation is what's being called the Islamabad Accord, a proposed deal that, on the surface, sounds like a straightforward path to de-escalation, but in reality carries layers of complexity. According to international reporting, the plan is structured as a two-tier agreement. The first stage focuses on an immediate ceasefire, essentially a pause in hostilities designed to stop further escalation and create breathing room for diplomacy. The second stage is where things become more ambitious, a long-term agreement that would aim to address the deeper issues driving the conflict, potentially reshaping regional stability for years to come. On paper, this kind of phased approach makes sense. You stop the fighting first, then negotiate the future. But history has shown that these transitions are rarely smooth. The stakes here are not just political, they're deeply economic. A successful ceasefire could calm global oil markets almost instantly, especially given the tension surrounding key routes like the Strait of Hormuz. Even the perception of stability in the region can influence fuel prices, inflation, and ultimately the cost of living for millions of people far beyond the Middle East. At the same time, preventing further escalation isn't just about avoiding war between two nations. It's about stopping a chain reaction that could pull in neighboring countries and expand into a much larger regional conflict. But what makes this deal particularly interesting is its name, the Islamabad Accord. That choice is not random. It signals a subtle but important shift in global diplomacy. By associating the deal with Islamabad, it reflects Pakistan's emerging role as a mediator in high-stakes international conflicts. This suggests that influence in global negotiations is no longer limited to traditional Western powers or regional giants. Instead, we're seeing new players stepping into the diplomatic spotlight, trying to shape outcomes in ways that reflect a more multipolar world. Still, there's an underlying question that cannot be ignored. When a peace deal is pushed forward quickly under pressure and deadlines, does it actually create lasting stability, or does it simply delay the next phase of conflict? That tension sits at the heart of the Islamabad Accord, making it both a potential breakthrough and a possible flashpoint. The United States has taken a firm and highly strategic stance in this situation, making it clear that Iran has essentially been given a narrow window to respond, accept the deal immediately, or face the consequences. According to Reuters, U.S. officials framed this as a necessary step to prevent further escalation, but the urgency behind it raises important questions. Why push such a critical agreement on such a tight timeline? In diplomacy, speed is rarely neutral. It usually reflects pressure, either from events on the ground or from internal decision-making circles. From a domestic standpoint, the U.S. leadership is likely balancing multiple layers of pressure. There is the expectation to appear strong on the global stage, especially in a conflict involving a long-standing rival like Iran. At the same time, there are economic considerations, particularly energy markets and inflation concerns that directly affect American voters. A prolonged conflict in the Middle East could disrupt oil supply routes, increase fuel prices, and create ripple effects across the economy. So, pushing for a quick resolution, even a temporary one, can be seen as an attempt to stabilize both geopolitical and domestic conditions. On the global front, the urgency also signals a desire to control the narrative and maintain influence in a region where alliances are becoming more fluid. With countries in the Gulf reassessing their positions and new diplomatic players emerging, the U.S. may see a fast agreement as a way to reassert leadership before the situation shifts further out of its control. But here's where it gets interesting. Deadlines in diplomacy often reveal more than they conceal. When one side imposes a strict timeline, it can sometimes indicate limited leverage or a need for a quick win rather than a carefully negotiated solution. This kind of pressure-driven decision-making isn't just limited to international politics, it's something people experience in everyday life. When you're forced to make a decision quickly, especially under pressure, are you truly making a thoughtful choice, or are you simply reacting to the situation in front of you? That same dynamic may be playing out here on a global scale. The U.S. approach, while assertive, risks being perceived not as strength but as urgency. And in high-stakes diplomacy, that perception can shape how the other side responds. Iran's response to the proposed deal has been swift, calculated, and very deliberate. Instead of engaging with the deadline set by the United States, Tehran has openly rejected the entire approach, making it clear that it will not negotiate under pressure. According to official statements reported internationally, Iran emphasized that deadlines and ultimatums are fundamentally incompatible with real diplomacy. In simple terms, their message is this: negotiations cannot happen when one side is simultaneously threatening consequences. That alone sets the tone for how Iran wants this situation to be perceived, not as a negotiation between equals, but as pressure being applied from one side. One of the most critical elements of Iran's response is its refusal to reopen key strategic routes, particularly under the conditions of a temporary ceasefire. This is significant because it directly impacts global trade and energy flows. But more importantly, Iran is signaling that it does not trust the idea of a short-term pause. From their perspective, a temporary ceasefire is not a step toward peace. It's a pause that could allow the opposing side to regroup and prepare for further action. That's why their messaging has been consistent. A ceasefire without a full and lasting agreement is not acceptable. What stands out here is how Iran is framing its position. Rather than appearing aggressive or confrontational, it is presenting itself as defensive and cautious. By arguing that negotiations must be free from threats, Iran is positioning itself as a party that values sovereignty and long-term stability. At the same time, by rejecting the reopening of strategic routes under pressure, it is reinforcing the idea that it will not make concessions unless its core concerns are addressed. This is a careful balancing act, projecting strength while avoiding the image of escalation. There's also a deeper layer to this response. Iran is not just rejecting a deal, it is challenging the entire structure of how the deal is being presented. By doing so, it shifts the focus from the content of the agreement to the conditions under which it is being offered. And that raises a critical question. Is Iran simply buying time, delaying decisions to strengthen its position behind the scenes? Or is it drawing a clear red line, signaling that certain terms are non-negotiable no matter the pressure? The answer to that question could shape what happens next in this already fragile situation.
The situation becomes even more complex when we look at what Iran is calling the Isfahan incident, a development that adds another layer of tension to an already fragile moment. According to statements from Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there are indications that the operation in Isfahan may have been a sabotage attempt aimed at accessing or even stealing uranium. Iran has gone a step further, describing the outcome as a scandal and a disaster for the United States, suggesting that whatever the objective was, it ultimately failed. These are strong words, and they are clearly intended to shape how this event is understood both domestically and internationally. But here's where things get more complicated. In modern conflicts, events like this are not just about what physically happened on the ground, they are also about how those events are interpreted and communicated. On one side, Iran is presenting this as a failed covert operation that exposes weakness and miscalculation. On the other side, there is limited independent verification of these claims, leaving room for multiple interpretations. This is where the line between information and narrative begins to blur. This incident highlights a critical aspect of modern geopolitical conflict: information warfare. Governments are no longer just competing through military or economic means, they are also competing to control the story. By labeling the operation as a failure and a scandal, Iran is not just reporting an event, it is actively shaping a narrative that reinforces its broader position. It supports the idea that external actions against Iran are not only aggressive but also ineffective, which strengthens its stance in the ongoing diplomatic standoff. What makes this particularly significant is how quickly such narratives can influence global perception. In a world where information spreads instantly, the first version of a story often becomes the most influential one, regardless of whether it is later challenged or corrected. This means that perception can sometimes carry more weight than verified facts, especially in fast-moving situations like this. And that leads to a deeper question that goes beyond this specific incident. In modern conflicts, what actually matters more? The precise details of what happened, or the version of events that people come to believe? Because in cases like Isfahan, the answer to that question can shape not just public opinion, but the direction of diplomacy itself.
One of the most surprising developments in this unfolding situation is coming not from Washington or Tehran, but from Doha. Qatar has reportedly become the first Gulf nation to take a step toward withdrawing U.S. troops from its territory, a move that could quietly reshape the entire balance of power in the region. While details are still emerging, the signal this sends is hard to ignore. For decades, U.S. military presence in the Gulf has been a cornerstone of regional security architecture. It has acted as both a deterrent and a symbol of American influence. But now, that foundation appears to be shifting. According to international reporting, this decision doesn't necessarily mean a complete break in relations, but it does suggest a recalibration. Qatar, like several other Gulf nations, has been navigating a complex geopolitical landscape where aligning too closely with one power can limit flexibility with others. By taking this step, Qatar may be signaling that it wants more strategic independence, more room to maneuver in a region where alliances are no longer as fixed as they once were. What makes this particularly significant is the broader message it sends to other countries in the Gulf. If one nation begins to reduce its reliance on U.S. military presence, it opens the door for others to reconsider their own positions. This doesn't happen overnight, but it creates a ripple effect. Over time, it could lead to a gradual weakening of the traditional alliance structures that have defined the region for years. This shift also reflects a larger global trend, the movement toward a more multipolar world. Instead of a single dominant power shaping outcomes, multiple countries are now asserting influence in different ways. In the Middle East, this means regional players are increasingly making decisions based on their own interests rather than simply aligning with external powers. It's a subtle but important change, and it suggests that the region is entering a new phase where influence is more distributed and less predictable. And that raises a critical question. If countries like Qatar begin to step back from long-standing military partnerships, does this mark the beginning of a broader transition? Could this be an early sign that U.S. dominance in the Gulf is gradually fading, replaced by a more complex and balanced power structure? The answer may not be immediate, but the direction of change is becoming harder to ignore.
One of the most critical pressure points in this entire situation is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water that carries a massive portion of the world's oil supply. And right now, Iran is making it clear that it will not reopen or secure this route under the conditions of a temporary ceasefire. That stance alone raises the stakes significantly. According to international reporting, Iran views any short-term agreement as unreliable, meaning it has little incentive to make concessions that could ease global tensions without receiving long-term guarantees in return. To understand why this matters, you have to look at the scale of what flows through this region. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. That means any disruption, even the perception of instability, can send shockwaves through global markets. Oil prices react quickly to uncertainty, and when prices rise, it doesn't stay confined to energy sectors, it spreads. Transportation costs increase, production becomes more expensive, and ultimately consumers feel it in everyday expenses. From gas stations in the United States to grocery bills influenced by shipping costs, the ripple effects are immediate and widespread. What makes Iran's position particularly strategic is that it's not just about blocking access, it's about leverage. By signaling that the strait will not be part of a temporary arrangement, Iran is effectively saying that economic pressure cannot be separated from political negotiations. In other words, control over this choke point becomes a bargaining tool, one that impacts not just the US, but the entire global economy. This transforms a regional issue into a global concern almost instantly. At the same time, this creates a delicate balance. Any move that threatens the stability of the strait risks provoking a stronger international response, potentially escalating the situation further. But holding that position also ensures that Iran remains central to any serious negotiation moving forward. It's a high-risk, high-impact strategy. And this is where the situation becomes more relatable than it might seem at first glance. This isn't just about distant geopolitics or complex diplomatic language. It directly affects everyday life. When tensions rise in places like the Strait of Hormuz, it shows up in fuel prices, in inflation, and in the cost of living. So while the headlines focus on negotiations and military posturing, the real impact quietly reaches people's wallets, making this global issue far more personal than it appears on the surface. As the situation unfolds, the focus begins to shift beyond individual events and toward a much larger question about how modern diplomacy actually works. Iran has openly accused the United States of prioritizing Israel's interests over broader regional stability, a claim that adds another layer of tension to an already complex dynamic. According to international reporting, Iranian officials argue that U.S. actions in the region are not driven by a desire for balanced peace, but by strategic alliances that shape its decisions regardless of the wider consequences. This accusation is not new, but in the current context, it becomes a central part of the narrative battle between the two sides. What we're seeing here is not just a disagreement over policies, it's a clash of narratives. On one side, the United States presents itself as working to prevent escalation and maintain order, framing its actions as necessary for stability. On the other side, Iran portrays those same actions as aggressive and one-sided, suggesting that they undermine genuine diplomatic efforts. Both narratives are carefully constructed, and both are aimed at influencing not just each other, but the global audience watching from the outside. In forums like the United Nations in New York, these competing messages become even more visible as each side seeks to gain support and legitimacy on the international stage. This is where a deeper shift becomes apparent. Diplomacy, in the traditional sense, is no longer just about negotiation and compromise. It is increasingly intertwined with strategic signaling, actions and statements designed to send messages, shape perceptions, and position each side for what comes next. Every move, whether it's a public statement, a rejected deal, or a military posture, carries meaning beyond its immediate impact. It becomes part of a larger strategy to influence how the situation evolves. And that raises an important question about what we are actually witnessing. Are these discussions and proposals genuine attempts to reach an agreement, or are they part of a broader effort to position each side for a longer, more drawn-out conflict? When diplomacy becomes a tool for signaling rather than resolution, the line between negotiation and preparation starts to blur. In that environment, even the appearance of dialogue may not necessarily indicate progress. It may simply reflect a different kind of strategy unfolding in plain sight.
With the Islamabad Accord already facing rejection and tensions continuing to rise, the real question now is what happens next, and the answer is far from simple. There are several possible paths forward, and each one carries its own risks and consequences. The first and most immediate scenario is escalation. When diplomacy stalls and both sides harden their positions, the chances of miscalculation increase. Even a small incident, whether military, economic, or cyber, could trigger a larger chain reaction. According to international reporting, the current environment is already highly sensitive, meaning that escalation doesn't always come from deliberate decisions. Sometimes it comes from a situation spiraling out of control. The second possibility is something much quieter, but often more impactful: back-channel negotiations. While public statements may sound firm and uncompromising, history shows that many high-stakes conflicts continue behind closed doors. These unofficial or indirect talks allow both sides to explore options without the pressure of public scrutiny or political image. In many cases, what appears to be a complete breakdown in communication is actually a shift from visible diplomacy to private negotiation. This creates a situation where the real progress, if any, is happening out of sight, while the public narrative remains tense and unresolved. Then there's a broader and longer-term scenario: regional realignment. The recent signals coming from Gulf nations, including shifting positions and strategic decisions, suggest that alliances in the Middle East are not as fixed as they once were. Countries are increasingly acting based on their own interests, rather than aligning strictly with traditional power structures. This could lead to a more fragmented but also more independent regional landscape, where influence is distributed among multiple players instead of being dominated by a single external power. What makes this moment particularly important is a pattern that often goes unnoticed. Deals like this rarely collapse in such a public and visible way unless something larger is unfolding behind the scenes. When negotiations break down openly, it can indicate that either the terms were never truly acceptable to begin with, or that both sides are positioning themselves for the next phase, whether that's renewed talks under different conditions or a more prolonged period of tension.
In other words, what we're seeing right now may not be the end of diplomacy, but a transition point. The surface story suggests failure, but beneath it, the real dynamics are still evolving, and those hidden movements will ultimately determine how this situation unfolds. At the end of the day, behind every headline, every statement, and every political move, there are real people living through uncertainty. Families waking up not knowing what tomorrow looks like. Workers feeling the pressure through rising costs. Entire regions holding their breath, hoping decisions made in conference rooms don't turn into consequences on the ground. This isn't just about power or politics. It's about stability, security, and the kind of world we're all moving toward. Now, I want to hear from you, but not just opinions. If you had to sum this situation up in one word, what would it be? Drop that word in the comments. Let's see how people across the world are really feeling about this. And if you want deeper, no-noise breakdowns like this, check out the video on your screen. You'll want to see that next. We put a lot of research and effort into bringing you clear, honest analysis. If you found value in this, consider subscribing. It's just one click, but it helps us keep going.